1 Corinthians chapter 9 is kind of broken up into three sections. Way back when, we covered the first section. All right? Today, I'm going to try and pick up with sections 2 and 3. All right? But section 1 was Paul addressing some of the issues that the church in Corinth had brought up to him. Some of the folks in Corinth were starting to question whether or not Paul had the authority to actually consider himself an apostle. Some folks were really talking, hey, these apostles, what right do they have to come to our churches and actually, kind of earn their subsistence from the ministry? And Paul's kind of gone through that first section, and he said, look, I gave up a lot of my rights when I came to ministry, you guys. There were a lot of things that I could have asked for from you, and I didn't. Okay? I could have looked for my subsistence from the church, but instead Paul, I believe he was a tent maker, right? He had a job. There were things that he did in the community to earn money. And so he had to address some of those things in that first section of chapter 9 here. He had to actually defend his place and authority as an apostle. Secondly, in verses 3 through 14, he had to defend his ability to accept what we would call payment for his ministry. In verses 15 through 18, we saw how Paul had not made use of these rights, but had instead given up much of what was due him and not stood on his rights while ministering to them. Today we're going to be picking back up with the rest of this chapter, and we're going to cover the last two sections in which Paul's going to show a number of other ways in which he has denied himself and for the ministry as a whole. And then finally, he's going to give us a really cool analogy that explains his motivations for all of his sacrifices. So if we take a look at verse 19, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I may win more." That verse is Paul starting off by asserting his liberties. He was a free-born citizen of Rome, who was neither in debt as a slave to any man, nor was he dependent on any others for his care and welfare. And yet, he made himself a servant to all. Paul behaved as a servant would. He ministered as an apostle for their good. He was careful to please as a servant would to his master. He acted in many cases as if he had no privileges, and all of this he did so that I may win more, or make more converts to Christianity. He made himself a servant so that others might be made spiritually free. As we move on through this section, Paul's going to get into the specifics of how he has been a servant in order to reach all sorts of people. From verse 20, "To the Jews I became as a Jew, so that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, though not being myself under the law, so that I may win those who are under the law." While Paul considered the law of the Old Covenant to be a burden that was taken off of us by Christ, he still submitted to it on many occasions so that he could minister to the Jews. Okay? By obeying the Mosaic law, he removed a lot of their prejudices and was therefore able to relate with them so that they could hear the gospel message and he could win them over to Christ. Paul did not try to preach to the Jews while he had a slab of pork ribs in his hands that he just got from the barbecue place next to the local pagan temple. You remember the debate that a lot of the Christians were having over whether or not they were allowed to eat the meat that had been sacrificed at the pagan temples. In verse 21, to those who are without the law, as without law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, so that I might win those who are without law. By those without the law, Paul is referring to the Gentiles, whether they were already Christians or not. In innocent things, he could comply with people's normal day-to-day actions or ways in which they acted for the advantage of relating to them. He would reason with the philosophers of Greece in their own way. And to the other new Christians he was around, he behaved as a person free from the bondage of the Jewish laws, all the while maintaining an obedience to the laws of Christ. He would not break the laws of Christ to please or impress any man. He would, however, accommodate himself to all while holding the godly principles in an effort to win all that he could. In innocent things, Paul neglected the right that he had to do otherwise and conformed to some of their traditions and customs. Doing good was the study and the business of Paul's life. So that he might guide others to Christ, he did not stand on his privileges and his authority. Verse 22. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that I may by all means save some. He was willing to make the best of them. He did not despise or judge people, but became one of them. He put aside his liberty to become one of them. He put aside his own interests for their sake and was careful not to put a hindrance in the way of their salvation. Where any, through the weakness of their understanding or the strength of their prejudices, were likely to fall into sin or fall off from the gospel into heathen idolatry, through his use of his own interests, he restrained himself. He denied himself for their sakes, so that he could create relationships of caring and trust, so that he might be a part of gaining their souls to Christ. In short, he became all things to all men, through all lawful means, that he might gain some. He would not sin against God to save the soul of his neighbor, but he would cheerfully and readily deny himself. The rights of God he couldn't give up, but he might resign his own rights, and he very often did for the sake of other people. Verse 23. Here we start to begin to see some of his reason for acting the way that he does. I do all things for the sake of the gospel, so that I may become a fellow partaker of it. That is to say, that for the honor of Christ, the owner of the gospel, and for the salvation of souls, which is the purpose of the gospel, so that we may all eventually partake together in the privileges and liberties of the gospel. For that reason, Paul has denied himself and met with others on their level and within their cultures in any way that he might do so in a godly fashion. A heart that is warmed with the love for God and longing for the salvation of men does not insist on having everything how we like it and insist on being recognized for all that we may be. To do so would be an abuse of power and speaks nothing of the spirit of the gospel message. How many of you folks have been on a missions trip outside the country? Okay. And now you can have that cross-cultural missions experience right here inside the country, right? What do we do when we go to a foreign country to share the gospel message? We don't act like Americans that are all proud of our rights and everything that we have that we need to be given when we're in this other country. We learn to speak their language. We learn their customs, right? If you're going to establish relationships with people, you go places, you find out what makes their culture tick, and you become a part of it. Does that mean that you are breaking the laws of Christ? That you are compromising your Christianity in any way? No. But you accommodate yourself to the people that you are trying to reach. Even in the military, we try to follow other customs for the sake of winning the trust of the local populations. How many of you guys have seen all the special forces dudes right now? May I say that they are all sporting the finest in facial hair. Okay? Why do they do this? It's an attempt to blend in with the culture that they're in, right? It's an attempt to earn respect and to show respect to the culture that they've put themselves into. Even if they have to act as warriors, they still attempt to blend into the culture. This does not just apply overseas, but it also applies next door. You know, we're supposed to be godly Christians, right? How many of you guys remember The Simpsons? Simpsons fans here? You remember Ned Flanders? Okay? How many of us do the Ned Flanders within our society? You know, we try to wear the tie everywhere we go. We try to have the little cross pendant, you know, that makes us obviously the Christian in every setting. And we have to, you know, we have to say oakley dokley to stand out that we're not using language, right? But we don't have to offensively stand out. What do you hear in an environment after Ned Flanders has walked out of the area? Boy, that guy is so judgmental. He can't even walk into a room without having to stand out and show how judgmental he is of everybody else around him. Okay? What about our work environments or the places that we go on a daily basis? How does this affect our behavior in those places? You know, I worked in the military for a long time. Did about 10 years with the Air Force. And then since then, I've been working as a defense contractor. I'm around military folks all the time. Have you listened to the way Marines talk? Okay? You know, you don't have to compromise your stance on language or condone theirs in order to hang out with a bunch of Marines. When you hang out with a bunch of Marines and you want to develop the kinds of relationships that allow you to share the gospel, you need to be a warrior. You need to man up a little bit. All right? That's what they had to do. Those guys have been out overseas kicking in doors, not knowing whether they were going to live on the other side of that door. Their language is a bit of an outlet. You don't have to condone it. You don't have to use it. But you have to respect them. Okay? And when you man up and toughen up a little bit without going down the route of machismo that they've taken on, they learn a whole new way to be a man and be a warrior. And they learned it through you, through Christ working through you. Okay. What is it that the lost around you genuinely need you to be so that they can see both the love and purity of God through you? Be warned, though. One of the easiest failings of Christians is to fall to one of those aspects at the expense of the other. We either sequester ourselves away from the world in a focus on godly holiness and fall into legalism like the Pharisees, or we dilute the fact that God changes lives with hard truths, and we fall into a free love Christianity like a bunch of church hippies. We're going to start diving into the last section here, verses 24 through 27. We're going to hear an explanation of the great encouragement that Paul had to act in this manner. He had a glorious prize, an incorruptible crown in view. In this section, he compares himself to the racers and combatants in the Isthmian Games, which, would have been an analogy very well known by the Corinthian people. Nowadays, we have to kind of relate that to the Olympics. How many of you have been watching any of the Olympics that have been going on? Interesting that that's going on right when we get into this whole section of text. Let's look at verse 24. Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may win. Everyone who wishes to compete in a race must run, but only one person wins and gets the crown. Paul is trying to excite us all to our duty. Run in such a way that you may win. But the Christian race is quite different from the games, in that only one person can win in those races. Yep. I'm going to say it right here. Christianity, in the race of Christianity, you can get a participation trophy. Everybody gets a participation trophy. We may all run the race in such a way as to achieve success. You have great encouragement, therefore, to persist constantly, diligently, and vigorously in your race. There is room for all to get to the prize. You cannot fail if you run well. So I was watching TV the other day, and of course one of these commercials comes on, and there's the clip. How many of you seen this clip? It's a bunch of ladies, so it's one of the women's races, right? And they, boom, goes the gun, and they all take off racing, and like right away, there's a bit of a kerfuffle. One of them trips. Like two of the ladies end up falling onto the ground. Have you seen this one yet? They get up, and they're crying. They're crying because they now have no hope of winning this race. Everything that they've worked for how long, all the training, everything, it's gone. Just like that. But they get up, and they continue. They pulled each other up, and they both got moving along again while they were both very emotional about their failure. They got up and kept running because it is a noble thing to do, but both of them had completely lost all hope of winning the prize at the end of the race. Christianity and our race is totally different. We all have hope. It doesn't matter how long or how tough our race is. It doesn't matter how many times we fall down along the way. The only real failure would be to quit, to turn our backs on God, and to just walk away. as long as we keep running for the finish line, God promises to be there to pick us up along the way when we fall, and finally, to catch us in His arms when we cross the finish line. Everybody who runs till the end of the race gets the prize. But there should be a noble emulation of the racers of this world. We should run diligently and with skill, that we might participate in a glorious contest to kind of see who gets to heaven first. Right? Excuse me. Or with the greatest rewards that are earned along the way. Paul continues this analogy in verse 25. Everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. They then do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. Competitors and wrestlers in the games have always been kept to strict diets and disciplines of practice. They do not indulge themselves, but they restrain in the foods that they eat or the liberties that they might practice. Should not Christians much more discipline themselves and give up liberties for the sake of others in light of so glorious an end as winning the race and the prize that we have before us? The competitors used a very strict diet, and they denied themselves much to prepare for their race. So did Paul, and so should we. How hard is it to run well if, for the sake of a heavenly crown, we cannot abstain from the temptations of this world? In verse 26, therefore I run in such a way as not without aim. I box in such a way as not beating the air. The people who competed not only were disciplined, but they also practiced their art. Those who would fight would practice by sparring with each other, or in many cases, just like today, they would be taught to shadow box, or would beat the air, as Paul calls it. Paul seems to have little time for simple practice in Christian warfare. The Christian doesn't get to practice. We're in combat all the time. Our enemies make fierce and hearty opposition, and they're always around us. We must always be on point. A Christian must fight not as those that shadow box at the air, but must strive against real enemies all the time. In verse 27, we see Paul call out one of those enemies. But I discipline my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified. Paul indicates that the body must be made fully subject and kept as a slave at all times. And by the term body, we are to understand fleshly appetites and inclinations. Paul set himself to make his body a slave, and he encourages others to do likewise. The athletes of this world who compete in the games were crowned with the withering leaves of an olive tree, or a bay tree, or the laurel tree. Nowadays, they wear a medallion around the neck. But Christians have an incorruptible crown in view, a crown of glory that never fades away, an inheritance reserved in heaven for them. Would we stand by and be outdone by sports competitors? Can they use diets and exert themselves in practice and expose themselves to hardships of competition with no more in view than the superficial cheers of a faceless multitude or a crown of leaves? And should we Christians, who hope for the gospel of the sovereign judge, the approval of a sovereign judge, and a crown of glory from his hands, stretch forward in the heavenly race and exert ourselves in beating down temptations and the strongholds of sin in our lives? Those racers ran in uncertainty. Everybody ran, but only one of them could ever reach for a prize. Second place really was just the first loser. But the Christian is at no such uncertainty. Everybody may run a life that leads to victory, but then we must run within the lines. We must keep to the path of duty that is placed before us. He who keeps to the path and keeps on his race will never miss his crown, though others might get there before him. If the world around us is ever capable of being disciplined and focused when it has no surety or expectation of success, then how much more should we Christians be? As the last note from verse 27, a preacher of salvation may yet miss it himself if he fails to evaluate his own heart. They could show many others the way and yet not get there themselves. To prevent this, Paul took great pains in subduing worldly temptations, just in case he who had preached to others would yet miss his crown. A holy fear of himself was necessary to preserve the character of an apostle. So how much more is it necessary for each of us not to get cocky in our race, but to stay focused on running a good race and reaching for the prize? Lord, as I said earlier, we've come from a lot of different places here. Each of us has been running a different race all week long, and we have completely different races ahead of us each this next week. God, I pray that we continue to evaluate our hearts, that we become disciplined. Lord, we need to spend time in our Bibles. We need to spend time with you. And we need to be disciplined at fine-tuning the skills of the Christian walk. But God, we know that as long as we remain focused on you, we thank you for the assurance that we have of our salvation through Christ Jesus. God, as we go forth, may you bless the lives of each and every person in this sanctuary.